Good evening and welcome everyone to the first keynote lecture of the Cultural Memory of Past Dictatorship Symposium. My name is Diana Popa and I am a postdoctoral research fellow with the Translating Memories, the Eastern European Past in the Global Arena project based at Tallinn University in Estonia. Together with Dr. Guido Bartolini from University College Cork, Ireland, we are the co-organizer of a series of introductory keynote lectures that took place in April and early May, and of this symposium that aims to explore the cultural memory of dictatorships across the globe. And this series of events is generously supported by our sponsors, the Irish Research Council, the National University of Ireland, the Centre for Advanced Studies at University College Cork, and the ERC project Translating Memories, the Eastern European Past in the Global Arena, funded by the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. This evening, we are honored to have with us Dr. Minna Niemi. Dr. Niemi is Associate Professor in the English Literature section at the Arctic University of Norway. She received her PhD in English from the University at Buffalo in 2011, and in 2017 completed an Academy of Finland-sponsored postdoctoral research grant at the University of Turku, Finland. Her book, Complicity and Responsibility in Contemporary African Writing, The Post-Colony Revisited, was published by Routledge in 2021. Her earlier work has appeared in CASiLaC, the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, the South African Journal of Philosophy, Journal of Southern African Studies, and Ariel. She is currently co-editing a collection of essays focusing on Zimbabwean politics of the past and working on her second monograph on Western complicity in the post-colonial political arena. Her talk today is entitled Western Readers and African Narratives Towards Responsible Reading Strategies. Minna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, for this generous introduction. And thank you both of you, Diana and Guido, for the wonderful event. I've enjoyed the talks today, and also very much the speaker series prior to the event. So it's been a real pleasure, and thanks for inviting me as well. I realized that my talk today might differ quite a bit from some of the other talks we've heard today, but hopefully there will be at least some overlapping interests, if not in any other ways, at least theoretically. So hopefully we can continue some of these conversations. Okay. So without further ado, I get started. Ashil Membe insightfully notes that when one says the word Africa, one generally abdicates all responsibility. Along these lines, I would like to briefly examine here the idea of Western countries and citizens denying their responsibility concerning colonialism and its aftermath. My particular interest is in the mechanisms at work in such abnegations of responsibility. Western countries and their citizens often, Western countries and their citizens often deny their complicity in global structural injustice. We can consider it in connection with the Sartrean notion of bad faith, as I will discuss soon. The key element in this process is a long-standing habit of normalizing racist practices that we have learned, we here have learned to take for granted. Such insidious structures become accepted as the way things are, and hence our moral conscience does not rebel against them. I will further discuss here how these structures of complicity does not, and denial of responsibility might also subtly inform Western literary consumption of contemporary African narratives, which is not unrelated to this amnesia or denial of cultural memory regarding colonialism. These reading practices tend to reproduce the dichotomy between the rational West and a chaotic, suffering, violent, and helpless Africa without paying attention to the historical structures that implicate Western readers in these crises. I contend, however, that the notion of bad faith is not sufficient as a concept when we consider Western consumption of African child social narratives or memoirs, which I will briefly do here. Instead, we need to look into the ideological premises of Western supremacy in order to understand the ongoing need to read stories of others' suffering. By relying on Slavoj Zizek's reading of ideology, I analyze these reading habits as a way in which Western readers can re-emphasize and reconvince themselves of the fantasy image of the unified and superior West. Along these lines, one of my interests today is to think through ideology as a term which not only shapes our understanding of complicity in the past dictatorial or totalitarian regimes, but also informs and structures Western investments in world politics today. Here, I would like to suggest that reading practices can subtly affirm these ideological structures. If we define responsibility through the idea of human interconnectedness, which binds us to one another and requires our attention towards each other's well-being, we can note how this ideal was firmly undone by colonization. Racist ideologies were part and parcel of emerging nation states, as overseas expansions and brutalities were legally justified and at least partly excused by the discourses of racial purity. Membe confirms this when he acknowledges that colonies might be ruled over in absolute, that colonies might be ruled over in absolute lawlessness, which stems from the racial denial of any common bond between the conqueror and the native. In discussing this lawlessness in connection with the notion of responsibility, we can note that the idea of human connectedness was undone by racist colonial ideologies, and that such a disconnection from human responsibility has had detrimental effects on the later formation of the post-colony as well. It also keeps informing Western contemporary denial of complicity in many current crises on the continent. Even if we, and here I understand that most of you or most of us don't necessarily identify with this subject position, but I unfortunately do. So forgive me for this. I try to eradicate it, but if it still creeps in, my apologies. Okay, so even if we, the current citizens of the first world countries, are innocent of certain wrongdoings of the past, such as colonialism, we might also benefit from these wrongdoings in the present. As Hannah Arendt writes, we are always held responsible for the sins of our fathers as we reap the rewards of their merits. In fact, racist ideologies and structures of exploitations are, in many cases, still in place, even if African countries have reached their independence and are considered equal with other nation states in Europe and elsewhere. The ways in which colonialism continues in a form of coloniality are clear. Western privilege remains predicated on the suffering in the formerly colonized world in the forms of sweatshops, unjust mineral extraction, environmental degradation, geopolitical military interference, and the depredations of the global food industry. Just to mention a few examples of structural injustice in which Westerners are highly implicated. Iris Marion Young's definition of structural injustice is helpful when we consider the role of Westerners as the beneficiaries of suffering in formerly colonized world. She writes, structural injustice exists when social processes put large categories of persons under systematic threat of domination or deprivation of the means to develop and exercise their capacities at the same time as these processes enable others to dominate or have a wide range of opportunities for developing and exercising their capacities. Westerners are complicit in the structural injustice between their wealthy countries and poorer post-colonial countries, as long-standing and normalized practices have benefited them and deprived those in the post-colonial world. These normalized and accepted practices become further problematized when we realize that a crucial legacy of colonialism is that the independent states in former colonies are particularly weak, often less democratic and less focused on national protection, partially due to various pressures coming from the former colonial centers, which want to protect their interests in these locales. In reality, today, as much as in the past, Westerners benefit from the fact that many nations in Africa, for instance, are not allowed to pursue their own democratic interests. I can say more about that later. These structures remain difficult to address, but the moral, if not legal, complicity of Western consumers remains strong. Citizens of wealthy Western states, however, seem to tolerate this form of complicity particularly well because of long-standing racist ideologies that have become normalized in everyday thinking. In order to comprehend the nature of this denial of responsibility, I would like to observe two different ways of normalizing these structures. The first one concerns Sartre's notion of bad faith that we could connect to Western liberal guilt, where people maintain structural injustice, even if they know that it is morally wrong. The second approach concerns more complex moral structures of Western ideological supremacy, which through developmentalist and humanitarian discourses becomes marketed as a benevolent will to help others in need. And it is this latter form that I connect to Western consumption of child soldier narratives. So let's first turn to Sartre's notion of bad faith, which can help us to explain the ways in which a person may avoid unpleasant truths in connection with structural injustices. Namely, Sartre writes that I must know in my capacity as a deceiver the truth which is hidden from me in my capacity as the one deceived. Better yet, I must know the truth very well, very exactly in order to conceal it more carefully. And Jacob Schiff concludes of Sartre's definition, quote, that maintaining oneself in bad faith requires a great deal of thought, unquote. And this is exact opposite of the banality of thinking that Hannah Arendt elaborates on. So actually remaining in bad faith requires a lot of thinking. It's an interesting way of thinking about that. So in many ways, this dilemma of bad faith pertains to most of us enjoying Western privileges. We are aware of the inequalities, but we still manage to hide this awareness from ourselves as we carry on. How can we deal with this in our everyday lives? Young and Schiff turn to Pierre Bourdieu's term habitus in order to explain the phenomenon. The concept of habitus as an immanent reproductive law and as the naturalization and denial of history helps explain the troubling persistence of bad faith. The denial of responsibility for structural injustice is not merely a momentary or even repeated choice to flee ourselves. Rather, such denial is learned through repetition in everyday life and over time is maintained without much thought at all. Oh, oops, sorry. Through repetition, injustice becomes normalized. It is precisely the denial and naturalization of colonial history, its deep racist structures and our troubling relation to it that beg to be addressed as the global neglect of the well-being of the post-colonial world so persistently continues in the West. And there are several works that try to, several scholars who try to address this. And here are two, Michael No's book, Just Liberal Violence is excellent. And Bruce Robbins is the beneficiary. Obviously, they take a different approach, but this is not exactly my topic today, but I just wanted to mention these quickly. So to sum up this discussion, we can say that not only are we, those of us in the global north, positioned in the world order in a way that structural injustice benefits us in an ongoing way. But with bad faith and the notion of habitus, we can see how the structures become normalized. In a sense, bad faith resembles what Zizek calls fetishistic disavowal, meaning that we cynically repeat doing things we already know are wrong or harmful. For instance, we keep shopping for clothes that are coming from sweatshop factories. However, here's something that I find important is that here we still interact with our conscience. In other words, we are aware of our wrongdoing, at least to minimal extent. In some sense, we're still aware of our complicity and the discomfort it creates in our minds, although minimally so. So the question of group cohesion is important here, as guilty-feeling liberal Western consumers who know better, but continue their habits regardless, they justify their behavior because others do it as well. But okay, so I would now like to venture to consider the other approach concerning the normalization of racist history and discuss the ideological premises of Western supremacy. But how did I end up here? And this is something that I've been only recently thinking through. So I've been trying to understand the Western interest in African child soldier narratives. These are narratives, either memoirs or novels written by or about African child soldiers during the last couple of decades. They usually focus on civil wars, on civil strife in various African locales. Instead of covering historical details concerning these wars, they follow a commodified structure. Thus, Eleni Kondoriotis argues that, quote, framed as a human rights literature, the child soldier narrative is too often sentimentalized and co-opted by ideas of the self that serve its accommodation with a largely first world distant reader, unquote. It is precisely its catering to Western interests that makes this genre so popular in the West. Some of them have been quite popular indeed. For instance, Ismail Bea's memoir, A Long Way Gone, which was published 2007, and I will return to it soon. Well, examining this interest in these narratives in the West, I have come to the conclusion that bad faith and normalization of structural injustice are not on their own sufficient tools to understand the so-called humanitarian consumption of these narratives of violence and victimization. Something else is at stake here when we encounter an ongoing need to consume narratives of suffering and otherness that at the same time enable us to re-emphasize our belief in Western supremacy. And we here. In terms of explaining the ongoing need to consume stories of otherness, Kay Schaffer and Sidney Smith in the recent book discuss various political insecurities at the end of the 20th century and read them in connection with, quote, markets that feed these insecurities and provide commodified stories through which readers can reinvent imagined securities, unquote. And they further argue that, quote, publishers and media conglomerates recognize that stories of suffering and survival sell to readers, unquote. Child soldier narratives can be seen as belonging to something called misery literature in an extreme sense, as the protagonists are simultaneously often both victims and perpetrators. But what makes these narratives particularly appealing is the underlying emphasis on Western values. According to David Mastey, quote, they portray the traumatic effects of the practice of recruiting child soldiers on the children themselves, as well as on Western conceptions of childhood that US readers are assumed to possess. Finally, they nearly always gesture towards the possibility of redemption. A few characters are ultimately denied in this regard, but many others are given the opportunity to become children again, often through the intercession of Western humanitarian aid workers, and in several cases by ultimately settling in Western countries. The stories reaffirm the Western notion of childhood, which is restored to the children saved from Africa. And Dina Mengistu sums this up by stating that, quote, what attracts immediate and superficial attention to Africa's child soldiers is that the brutal existence of a child soldier dovetails neatly with depictions of Africa, both as a place born of hell and misery, and as a continent that, like a child, can be saved, unquote. In other words, these narrative structures do not invoke liberal guilt in readers, the guilt which would remind us that we might be complicit in the political structures that have created these crises. Instead, the Western subject or reader can often enjoy moral superiority when reading these narratives. As Minna suggests, quote, the humanitarian agent effectively becomes the hero of the romance in the place of the child soldier as hero. If the humanitarian agent becomes the hero of the narrative, then the victimhood of child soldiers also becomes highlighted. And Roni Broman puts it this way: he to whom humanitarian action is addressed is not defined by his skills or potential, but above all by his deficiencies and disempowerment. It is this fundamental vulnerability and dependency rather than his agency and ability to surmount difficulty that is foregrounded by humanitarianism. These coded ideological prerogatives invite us to justify Western humanitarian approach to crises in Africa and other regions. And if these accounts perceive or narrate structural injustice, it is identified as existing elsewhere and not as a structure that would implicate Western people. Instead, this Western discourse functions as a corrective force to these presumably non-Western problems, including wars, famine, and chaos. At the same time, Western values remain celebrated and promoted, and Western involvement in the ongoing crisis, be that colonial, post-colonial, neoliberal, military, remains firmly excluded from the picture. This humanitarian ideology enables people in the West to feel morally right about their actions in the globalized world. Instead of struggling with bad conscience, at least to a minimum extent, people can instead celebrate the Western role as the morally right. In other words, humanitarianism depends on the normalization of structural injustice in the world, but it does more than that. It glorifies the Western position in the world as the only right-minded one, bringing hope and democracy to others. It also creates social cohesion by unifying people behind group thinking. I maintain that these are the key issues behind the need of consuming stories of others' suffering. Well, in order to understand this logic of libidinal gratification resulting from moral superiority, I will turn to Zizek's reading of political theory. His theory enables me to study the unconscious investment in complicity more closely. Ilan Kapoor writes, quote, one of Zizek's significant contributions to political theory has been to make the notion of jouissance a political factor, showing how it is a crucial ingredient in the formation of political community and identity, unquote. In a sense, then, one could say that Zizek takes one step further from Bourdieu's theory of habitus as a concept that is based on social cohesion, and to consider human libidinal interests as a crucial part of this process of creating social cohesion. Humanitarian interests are, in fact, intrinsically related to group cohesion in the West, which is ideologically produced. If in the past, the ties of responsibility were undone during colonialism, the colonizing mission was also partly justified as a civilizing mission, which produced a shared understanding among colonizers of their own cultures as superior. The current humanitarian interest in helping others in pain reproduces this logic of superiority, and not only superiority, but it also produces a polished and idealist fantasy image of the West that is not racist, but instead deeply caring, as it is invested in democracy and others' well-being. The West is not a unified cultural territory, but it is this ideological fantasy image that the Western countries desperately depend upon. When we consume stories unconsciously supporting or re-emphasizing Western moral goodness, we can feel assured that we are on the right path. I would suggest that this partially explains the readerly need to return to commodified narratives of humanitarian salvation. And the sublime object of ideology, CASiLaC writes that the function of ideology is not to offer us a point of escape from our reality, but to offer us the social reality itself as an escape from some traumatic real kernel, unquote. So the fantasy image of the West is precisely that. It creates a unified image of itself. How we see the world is related to this fantasy, which allows us to escape so-called reality with its deep antagonisms. Humanitarian ideology produces the notion of the West as a superior, unified culture. In other words, this fantasy enables its adherents to overlook the chaos within Western cultures, rising political populism, environmental crises, mass unemployment, etc., and project an image of them instead as unanimous democracy-loving entities that have the cultural capital at their disposal to decide what is wrong and what is right in the world. In Enjoy Your Nation as Yourself, CASiLaC writes that, quote, Eastern Europe functions for the West as its ego ideal, the point from which West sees itself in a likable, idealized form as worthy of love. The real object of fascination for the West is thus the gaze, namely the supposedly naive gaze by means of which Eastern Europe stares back at the West, fascinated by its democracy, unquote. One could read a lot into this statement today, in today's political situation, but I'm providing it here as a structure that reveals the Western need for the other's gaze, that convinces the West of its superiority and the other's desire. One could even suggest that Western countries and cultures need the others in order to make their own cultural belonging seem harmonious. In his recent book, Ilan Kapoor reads this CASiLacian notion of ideology in connection with the developmentalist narrative. And this is a long quote. This is very important for me, so that's why I included it. If the racialized third world other did not exist, it would have to be invented in order to sustain the idea of harmonious West or stable global order. This is to say that the only function of the fantasy figure of the other is to make people believe that a harmonious West exists, covering up that it is impossible. A capitalist society, Western or third world, is always already riven with antagonisms and disorder, social inequalities, ecological disintegration, dispossession of the poor, war and conflict, crisis of democracy, etc. Thus, the West is precisely not the ideal or exemplar it is made out to be, and racism is its symptom. So, using CASiLacian terminology, we can see how this ideological fantasy of its own superiority enables the West to avoid staring at its own wounds. Instead, this fantasy gives it a chance to project some coherence and consistency on its own troubled existence. How could certain reading practices conform to or give support to this idealized image of the West? Why is there such a strong need to consume narratives from elsewhere that reproduce Western ideals of humanity? How do marketing interests play into this? What type of readerly complicity can we identify here? Well, I cannot address all of these questions today, but my hypothesis is that the consumption of stories of others' suffering and humanitarian salvation convince us of our superior Western values, ours and ours. But these stories need to be retold in order to provide a repeated justification and confirmation of these values. And in a sense, these stories are told every day in the news, for instance. The news narratives very often repeat this sort of similar ideological stand. I will now move on to analyzing the Western humanitarian consumption of African child soldier narratives and try to understand the underlying need for reading these practices, these narratives, sorry. This is a boom that particularly marked the beginning of 2000s. And in fact, this was the cultural moment when the US experienced a great shock, which was the attack against the World Trade Centers. As a response, the nation built stronger ideological narratives, justifying the annihilation of evil forces and restoring peace on earth. It launched the war on terror and started the war in Iraq. The new era also strongly affected American interests in Africa. Elizabeth Smith discusses the contemporary Western interest and involvement in African crisis and writes that the African continent returned to the US radar screen after the September 2001 terrorist attacks, and the war on terror became a focal point of US Africa policy. In choosing its partners, Washington focused primarily on countries that were endowed with energy resources or critical to the war on terror, even though these countries were often governed by corrupt, oppressive political and military elites. In other words, the US has had major geopolitical and economic interests in Africa during the last couple of decades. However, when narratives describing conflicts in various African regions reach American audiences, they are almost always separated from the US and or European political interests in the continent, and I instead served up as a universalized stories of horrid human suffering and brutality removed from historical specificities. When we consider African literature and Western readership in general, we can argue that in their approaches to African literatures, Western readers are particularly susceptible to cultural oversights, simplifications, and stereotyping. The denial of colonial history discussed by Schiff earlier along Bourdieu's concept of habitus is crucial here as well. An abnegation of responsibilities enabled by those age-long racist practices of not knowing individual African countries and cultures by name, let alone languages, but rather considering the continent through the lens of a singular African culture or language and country. This holds true regarding literary approaches as well. African writers have resisted stereotypical images of Africans for decades now. In a recent TED talk, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie challenged the notion of a single African story, focusing on the violence and misery on the continent. As such, an understanding persistently creates a stereotypical approach to perceived monolithic African existence. However, even if the readership is more varied today, and that is definitely true, it is much more varied today, and there's a lot of scholarship that emerges to counter simplified stereotypes, these images still stubbornly persist. In addition to that, Spencer notes that, quote, we in the West are often subliminally encouraged to read those texts that do reach us in ways that flatter rather than challenge our preconceptions, unquote, of our implicated relations to various crisis situations in African countries, as our reading habits tend to reproduce the moral high ground of Western humanitarianism without the deeper insight into its premises. This phenomenon of only certain types of stories reaching us has everything to do with the so-called post-colonial exotic as a marketing technique. In fact, post-colonial narratives are today a major part of the transnational cultural industry, which capitalizes on the long-standing literary tradition of producing and marketing exoticized images of post-colonial cultural others for a hungry Western audience eager to consume narratives of cultural difference. And this is obviously well documented by Graham Hagan in his seminal work. So the perception of African fiction and the question of which African narratives are published are heavily predicated on Western markets' need for particular African narratives. The late Binuawanga Wainaina, Kenyan writer, satirically framed this need for simplified exotic images of Africa in his hit article, How to Write About Africa. So these are quotes from his text. Always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use these. In your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. It is hot and dusty with rolling grassland and huge herds of animals and tall, thin people who are starving. Don't get bogged down with precise descriptions. Always end your book with Nelson Mandela saying something about rainbows or renaissances because you care. Wainaina's satirical approach to writing about Africa inadvertently provides us with an image of the Western readership ready to consume exotic and ahistoricist narratives of Africa stripped from cultural specificities. The reading patterns suggested by this account get all the more morally complicated when we consider life narratives written by former child soldiers who, to quote McKay, are among the world's most vulnerable populations, unquote. When considering the markets for this particular literary genre, it is thus crucial to consider its underlying power hierarchies. They can be read in connection with what Gayatri Spivak has defined as the culture of testimony, quote, the genre of the subaltern giving witness to oppression to a less oppressed other, unquote. This is troubling as we see how Western markets create the codes for particular types of narratives to be produced, marketed, and consumed. And by so doing, the markets also regulate complex issues concerning the representation of violence, responsibility, and guilt. How one's guilt is testified or confessed to becomes intertwined with the Western audience's need to consume certain narrative patterns. And there are, in fact, certain telling patterns in place when considering the child soldier memoirs. With the child soldier narratives, there is a repeated Western investment in children's innocence. Laura Susky makes the point that as the poorest of the poor, children function in the discourse of development as testaments to international suffering, as deviants from the modern childhood. Their fundamental narrative role is to plead for the restoration of their childhoods. In the case of the child soldier narratives, the structure of losing and regaining one's innocence can be related to the romance genre or structure, as Minna has suggested. These stories include the narrative of a descent into violence and a loss of childhood or selfhood, and then a regaining of the moral self along with peace and freedom. And she further adds that humanitarianism in particular might well seem to lend itself all too readily to romance and in ways that risk usurping the role of hero for its own ends, unquote. Very often then, the humanitarian intervention, the action Western readers can identify with, saves the child from Africa and delivers him or her to the Western context where he or she can once again become a child. The stories are often mediated by Western agents, as forewords written by them help the reader to connect to the text. These scaffolding structures also enable a celebration of individual humanity and survival, intrinsically Western values that have reinforced humanitarian readerly consumption patterns, according to Schaffer and Smith. The following three components, an emphasis on one's unique story, the romance of restored childhood innocence, and the Western humanitarian involvement in the restoration process, are elements of memoir that Western readers find appealing. These features can all be found in the memoir written by a Sierra Leonean former child soldier, Ismail Bea, and his book is titled A Long Way from Home. During the first year of its publication, Bea's memoir sold over 600,000 copies, making him, according to Dave Eggers, quote, arguably the most read African writer in contemporary literature, unquote. So his book has sold more copies than Jem Coetzee Waiting for the Barbarians or any other African novels. And Bea writes, I wanted to, this is from the memoir, and he also has talked to the audience, repeating the same ideas. I wanted to avenge the deaths of my family. I also had to get some food to survive. And the only way to do that was to be part of the army. It was not easy being a soldier, but we just had to do it. I have been rehabilitated now, so don't be afraid of me. I'm not a soldier anymore. I'm a child. We are all brothers and sisters. There's a lot that one could do with this quote, and I'm not criticizing Bea here. I understand that he has gone through quite the ordeal, and there's been a lot of discussion of his memoir, and in fact, is it actually true or not, has also been discussed. But I just want to look at this quote briefly, because I understand I'm running out of time. That here Bea captures his descent into violence and his subsequent emergence from it. Through rehabilitation, he becomes a child. This statement takes it at face value that being a child cannot indicate anything harmful. A child doesn't harbor violent thoughts. What he was before was something else, but after spending time at the UNICEF-run rehabilitation center, he has changed fundamentally. Later, Bea has become a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and a speaker at the UN Children's Parliament. In late 1990s, he was adopted by the American storyteller Laura Sims. So his story follows very much these sort of parameters that I mentioned earlier. Okay, getting there. Instead of consuming this story as an individualistic salvation story from African horrors, we could also look into Sierra Leone's civil war's historical premises and into the neoliberal diamond industry in the country, which enables the profits to flow out of the country and keeps the majority of people in acute poverty, provoking civil strife. And we could pay attention to the crushing pressures put on Sierra Leone by such economic institutions as the IMF and the World Bank. So when writing about child soldiers in the civil war in Sierra Leone and the underlying problems provoking the crisis, A.B. Zach Williams argues that the super exploitative nature of imperialism imposed via the collusion of a local kleptocratic elite has led to capital flight, uneven development, and the inability of local social institutions, such as the family, to cope with the exigencies of life within peripheral capitalist formations. However, these problems outlined by Zach Williams are not the type of questions that are addressed in the context where child soldier narratives are read and discussed in the West. Instead, readerly expectations relate to a phenomenon which Eleni I don't know how to say her name, Kondoriotis has defined as arrested historicization, a narrowing down of historical scope. Oops, what happened there? Okay, there, sorry. Child soldier narratives written and marketed outside of Africa are symptomatic of an arrested historicization, in part because they produce a metaphor of African childhood that is politically limiting as a characterization of historical agency of the continent's peoples. However, Kondoriotis, along with many others, takes issue with these patterns and analyzes Emmanuel Dongala's Jonisien Mejan and Amadou Kourouma's Allah n'est pas obligé, two Francophone novels. So she analyzes them as recent child soldier novels that resist the appropriation of African war narratives by human rights discourse, as Dongala and Kourouma's novels refuse the pedagogic and didactic agenda of human rights fiction. These fictional texts manage to talk back to the image of the child soldier created for Western appetites. In other words, there are writers and critics, whose work I have also referred to here today, who call attention to troubling patterns of humanitarian consumption. So this brings me back to the questions I started with, and this is my conclusion. Colonial amnesia, or the denial of cultural memory of colonialism, and the deep structural injustice that prevails in the world today. Novels such as Dongala and Kourouma's refuse to conform to the existing notions of African child soldiers who as figures supposedly remain unrelated to global structural injustices. And by so doing, they challenge the historical amnesia of colonialism and its aftermath. They managed to shake the image, but I'm not prepared to argue that one can change these Western literary consumption patterns very easily. The selling figures tell us a story about the unconscious need to read certain stories that conform to our existing understanding of the world, order, and values that the Westerners cherish. In that sense, the demand for a certain type of literature might overpower any historical facts that we could reveal to readers concerning the nature and history of existing crises in various parts of Africa. As Ilan Kapoor sums it up, quote, most often it is not a lack of knowledge that is the problem, but our unconscious commands and passions that bind us to ideology despite critical distance, unquote. And he's here paraphrasing Zizek. I hence conclude that Western readers' investments in simplified stories representing African crises are marked by strong political undercurrents, even if they paradoxically are often labeled as unpolitical and sentimentalized. This phenomenon is created and enabled by the historical amnesia of colonialism and imperialism, as these ideologies have for centuries now normalized racism and told Western subjects that they can abnegate responsibility when it comes to questions pertaining to Africa. Is it then a coincidence that humanitarian reading patterns do not focus on the history of colonialism or Western power in the present? No, it is not, because that would reveal a troubling rift in the West's own existence and force it to traverse its own fantasies, making it look vulnerable, confused, and lacking in power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minna, for this rich presentation and lots to take in. I'm happy to open the floor for discussion. So if people have questions that they would like to start us off with, I'm happy to give the floor to anyone willing to start the conversation. And I see Guido has his hand up. So please, Guido, go ahead.
Yes, hi, hello, and thanks a lot, Minna. It was very, very rich and compelling and speaks to many of the issues that we would like to address in the conference. And so I would like to ask something that is also an issue that on which I struggle in my own work, which concerns, in a way, the use of we, but just not only when we write and speak, but also above all in the way we think about these issues, in the sense that, of course, we are all aware that by using this perspective, we risk to reify some form, of imagined communities that is often and inevitably exclusionary. It can create, this tension between an us and a them, we and they, that we don't want to reproduce. But at the same time, because since I'm trying to work on responsibility and implication, for me, then thinking also in terms of we is also the way to try to have, the language, the mental structure to highlight the structural mechanisms of injustice, repression that we as a society, we produce. So how do we address this conundrum? What's your take on that? What's your suggestion? Thanks.
Thank you, Guido. That's a really important observation and question, and I think that in a sense, one could think about it as a Freudian slip that I have it there, but it's not only that, because the beginning of I started this talk, or this talk is partially taken from the afterword from my book, which focuses on African fiction and the question of responsibility and complicity. And I have totally changed it for this event, but I felt complicit when I was writing it, because, well, I am a Western subject, and there's this sort of like almost there's this some sort of sense of a very strong feeling of implication, and sort of got, I guess, in a way, coming out saying that, okay, well, I do realize that I here belong to this so-called we, but at the same time, it might also become restricted in a sense that like that it then it again highlights the Western subjects. So I should have thought about it more carefully before I started with my talk today, because but you see, there's this kind of like a psychological feeling of common necessity to come in the open and say like, okay, yeah, I'm one of those, but at the same time, it doesn't really change anything. I'm still equally implicated in all those structures. They still benefit me even if I say that I'm one of them. But okay, I don't know, it's been a long day. It wasn't very helpful, but thanks for the remark. Yep.
And thank you, Minna, for your answer. And Joe has a nice follow-up question to what you are discussing. Joe, would you like to come in and ask your question aloud, or shall we just?
It's an impossible question, actually. It was more just, I was thinking about it as you were talking at the beginning of your talk, and I really, we can't. So my question is, what is the relationship between this kind of implication and individual responsibility? We can all say we are in the West, we as a certain skin color, we're all implicated in certain structures of power, but what can we actually do to change that? So what is the line between this kind of implication and then individual responsibility? And that's an impossible question, but it's also something that I think I battle with in my everyday life, but also in all of the classes that I teach. My students have the same problem. We can recognize the Western gaze, but we can't really undo it.
Yes, that's really important, and so that's I think it's the book edited by Affecciento, again another very difficult name, but it's about complicity, and they talk about they differentiate between complicit, being complicit in wrongdoing and being anti-complicit, because everyone is complicit to a certain extent, but then when you're anti-complicit, then you acknowledge your complicity and try to work against the injustices as much as you can. Mark Saunders would talk about responsibility and complicity to kind of acknowledge the idea that we are complicit, but at the same time we should try to do things differently. But yes, this is I don't have a bulletproof answer, and as you said kindly enough, that this is an impossible question. But if we go to CASiLaC, he would say that there's the idea of traversing your fantasy, that okay, ideologies, we can expose them, and so in a sense, if we think about the unconscious logic here a little bit, so that when we know that something is wrong and yet we still keep doing it, that already sort of suggests that there's a certain form of agency involved, that because we can stop doing it. But then what are the options? So yes, that's a really good observation. I wish I had the crystal ball, and I think we all would like to have an answer to that question. Yes, thanks.
Yes, thank you. And Professor Lim, would you like to ask your question next?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, Minna, but while I was listening to you, I found myself modifying your title with the Eastern instead of Western. I mean, the Eastern readers and the African narratives. A couple of weeks ago, I read in the news that a Chinese who are now stationed in Africa, they were whipping African Africans, right? So they were arrested and they were brought to the court. And then I'm not sure, for example, the Eastern readers in double sense. I mean, I'm thinking of the socialist acumen and their attitude towards Africans in the 1960s and 70s. You know, usually Eastern European countries, socialist countries have kept a very close ties with African countries, and the Lumumba University in Moscow and also many Eastern European countries actually invited many African students, right? And they to show that, oh, we are different from those Western imperialists. But I'm not sure if this their attitude towards Africans in the socialist acumen was really different from the Western countries. And also today's Chinese and Japanese and Korean, they gaze at Africa. How are they different from Westerners? I mean that sometimes the socialist acumen countries people and the East Asian people, Eastern readers could be more cruel or brutal than the Western readers because they are exempt from any mnemonic responsibility, or they don't have any feeling of complicity in the exploiting African countries under the frame of that's a Western country's fault. That's Western country's guilt. We are totally innocent towards Africans. So this sort of lack of any complicity of the guilt consciousness, in a sense, has led those countries, Eastern readers, right, to their gaze to African countries sometimes more irresponsible and more brutal and more cruel. That's one point. And the other point is that I mean, you know the Mbembe debates in Germany that broke out in the year 2020 when the Mbembe was invited to Triennale in the Rhineland area, and actually a guy who is the chairperson of the Jewish community in Germany and also won the FDP, a politician there, actually began to accuse of Mbembe of anti-Semitism by citing his remarks about a juxtaposition of apartheid with the Holocaust and the Israeli policies towards Palestinians. And then, of course, perhaps nobody among us would believe that Mbembe was anti-Semite, but means that sometimes I feel that Holocaust, when we had the debates about the Holocaust as a continuity of colonialism, there was a very strong resistance about this case, especially from German historians who were very critical of the Holocaust in their own histories. But I'm quite sure, I mean, the German policy towards the Slavic people, Slavic neighbors, simply to me, so they were repeating these colonialist discourses and colonialist practices in the Eastern Europe because they couldn't colonize Asia or Africa. The Eastern Europe was the Slavic neighbors was the only remaining no man's land for German colonialism in a sense, right? But I think that this your gaze or the critical intellectuals you cited in Western countries or certain Western Europe, I'm not feeling a sort of complicity and responsibility about the African past, African present is very important, but also they need to, in a sense, to me, from the outsider's view, they need to gaze at themselves, right? And they treated some Europeans also as Africans in some sense. And so to me, as a scholar of who is now working on the global memory space or global memory formation, that sort of entanglement of the Holocaust memory in Western Europe and sort of colonial history or colonialist past in the other non-European countries would be very much important thing. And I think so that's why you talk about this very interesting talk about the European Western readers' complicity, Western readers' a approach to African present and past, might give us a very interesting clue to how to understand the entanglement of those memories in the, Mark Majo's very interesting book, Black Continent, Dark Continent, right? Dark Continent is a contemporary history of Europe. It was not a contemporary history of Africa. But under the title of Dark Continent, while he was talking about the contemporary 20th century of European history, I think his intention is quite clear. And this sort of criticism or self-criticism, not by citing Africa, but by citing Europe itself, I think it could be also very important to understanding this complexity or complicatedness of this 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I try to answer at least some of these very important points you made. So basically, what you first referred to, it's the Cold War politics. Africa was basically divided between the Eastern and Western Bloc, and it was it's very detrimental to various countries. Like after they gained independence, then they were divided between the two blocks, and that has interesting has had an interesting political aftermath, and even today, and it's very important that you pointed out that this kind of Western ideological reading that I was doing here is not sufficient. Of course not. This is one ideological this is one ideology among many problematic ideologies that we can identify in the world today. I don't know that much about how African narratives are read in various Asian countries, but of course I know the major economic interest China has in African countries, and so I do know about that a little bit. But absolutely, there are very important ideological factors at play on that side too, and then in connection to that, of course, also when you said that Africans should look at themselves as well, and this is something that my whole book was about. It was basically I read about I analyzed several writers, Somalian, Ghanaian, South African, among others, who critically examined the so-called post-colony, which is Achille Mbembe's term for the sort of continuity of colonial overpowering in the post-colonial state. So basically, very much sort of looking at these texts focus on the kind of like the African problems, but at the same time, there's always the imperial history that has so much. It affects the present day situations in most of the African cultures quite a lot. And I actually decided to talk about this topic today because I knew that there are no people working on African literature here. So that was one of the reasons why I thought that I take that. But okay, so I didn't know about Mbembe being called an anti-Semitist. That's I've never heard of that, but I look into that. That's troubling. But one last thing I say is just about the Holocaust. So what does that have to do with colonialism? Well, there's a lot of research. Hannah Arendt, for instance, is one of the other researchers who made that connection that in fact, the genocide in Europe was possible because it had been already practiced in the colonies. It had been sort of studied how you can do something quite that horrific. So there's a lot. There's definitely a connection there. Yes, but thank you very much for these extremely important observations. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this wonderful answer. And we have a comment in the chat. I'm mindful of the time. I'm not really sure if, it's like, I think this is the perfect note to end our keynote on. If nobody has a burning question or a comment, then I would be happy to close our first day of the conference here, and to invite everyone to thank our wonderful keynote speaker, Minna, Niemi. Thank you so much for this great lecture, for your questions, for the wonderful audience that we have here with us today, throughout the day. And thank you so much. And we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at 9 in the morning with Professor Lim's keynote speech, or keynote lecture that we start with tomorrow. So see you tomorrow and have a good and well-deserved rest. Bye-bye.